There was a season in your life when your presence was constant, when your voice filled rooms, conversations, arguments, and explanations. People grew accustomed to your reactions. They learned the rhythm of your emotions, the tone of your defense, the way you would clarify yourself when misunderstood. Over time, they developed an unspoken confidence that no matter what happened, you would respond. They expected your engagement. They relied on your replies. They assumed your availability was permanent. What they never anticipated was the version of you that would withdraw without warning, the version shaped not by pride, but by divine alignment. They did not prepare for your silence because they misunderstood it. They thought silence meant defeat. They thought silence meant retreat. What they failed to understand was that God was building something in you that did not require noise to prove its existence. Watch this video until the very end, because every layer of this message connects. And write your warmest wishes in the comments, and write Amen along with the number 99. This is not about desperation. It is about agreement. When your intentions are spoken in faith and placed in harmony with God's timing, unseen movements begin. But now, let us return to the silence that changed everything. Because what appeared empty from the outside was in truth the beginning of your reconstruction. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get started. What they interpreted as emptiness was in reality the careful construction of a new foundation within you. When you chose not to respond the way you once would have, it was not because you lacked words. It was not because you were incapable of defending yourself. It was not because you suddenly became indifferent. It was because something deeper had begun forming inside you, something deliberate and steady that required stillness to mature. Your silence became the space where your thoughts reorganized themselves, where your emotions recalibrated, where your reactions were no longer automatic but examined. There were days when you felt the familiar urge to speak, to correct narratives, to address misunderstandings directly. The impulse to reclaim your voice and set the record straight would rise within you, not out of ego, but out of a desire for fairness. Yet each time that impulse surfaced, something steadier intervened. There was a quiet awareness guiding you, a reminder that not every accusation demands defense and not every misunderstanding deserves explanation. God was teaching you restraint, not as suppression, but as mastery. Inside that restraint, discipline was forming. Discipline is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with applause. It grows quietly, in moments when you choose composure over reaction. It strengthens each time you allow silence to hold what anger once carried. In the absence of immediate response, you were not shrinking. You were strengthening. You were learning that power is not always expressed through confrontation, but often revealed through control. What they saw as withdrawal was actually recalibration. You were adjusting the internal compass of your identity, where once you measured your worth against their opinions, you began measuring it against your alignment with God. Where once you felt compelled to maintain connections at any cost, you began recognizing the cost of constant emotional expenditure. Silence became the tool that separated impulse from intention. It allowed you to examine who you were becoming, rather than who they expected you to remain. There was a time when confrontation felt necessary, when speaking up seemed like the only way to protect your name or preserve your dignity. You believed that explanation equaled clarity, and that clarity would restore balance. Yet over time, you noticed something subtle but undeniable. Explanations did not always lead to understanding. Sometimes they only fueled further debate. Sometimes they provided more material for those who thrived on conflict. Slowly, you began to see that constant engagement was not resolution. It was repetition. As this realization settled into you, the need to respond began to lose its urgency. Not because you became indifferent, but because you became aware. A higher awareness took root within you, and that awareness whispered that your energy was too valuable to be spent on cycles that produced no growth. You began to observe patterns instead of participating in them. You noticed how certain dynamics depended entirely on your emotional involvement. Without your reaction, those dynamics struggled to survive. God was shifting your perspective. He was revealing how much of your previous exhaustion came not from the actions of others, but from your constant willingness to engage. You had been strong, but strength without boundaries leads to depletion. Silence introduced boundaries without hostility. It created distance without drama. It redefined your presence without requiring explanation. And in that redefinition, something powerful occurred. Your absence began to speak louder than your arguments ever had. At first, they assumed your quietness was temporary. They believed you were processing, regrouping, preparing for a stronger response. They anticipated the moment when you would reappear with clarity and confrontation. But as days stretched into weeks, and weeks into longer spans of quiet detachment, a different realization began to form in their minds. Your absence was not strategic in the way they expected. It was not the silence before a storm. It was the silence of departure from a battlefield you no longer recognized as worthy of your presence. When your name was mentioned, there was no reaction from you to analyze. When speculation circulated, there was no defense to dissect. The usual emotional exchange was gone. And without it, the dynamic shifted uncomfortably. They were left to face their own words without your counterbalance. They were left to question their assumptions without your participation validating the importance of those assumptions. Ego thrives on engagement. It feels significant when it can provoke response. It feels powerful when it can extract emotion. But when you stopped offering either, the ego encountered something unfamiliar: irrelevance. Your silence did not attack them. It simply removed itself from the equation. And in that removal, their sense of control weakened. They had prepared for resistance. They had prepared for reaction. They had prepared for a version of you that would defend, argue, clarify, and explain. What they had not prepared for was the version of you who understood that not every misunderstanding is meant to be corrected publicly, and not every narrative needs your energy to dissolve. While they speculated about your motives, something far more significant was happening within you. You were not merely choosing silence as a tactic. You were undergoing transformation. The silence became a sanctuary where you could hear your own thoughts without interference. It allowed you to evaluate your patterns without distraction. It gave you the opportunity to see yourself clearly, beyond the reflections others projected onto you. In that sanctuary, God refined your perspective. He showed you that identity anchored in external validation is fragile. He revealed that true strength does not require constant demonstration. You began to see that your value was not diminished by silence. It was clarified by it. The less you explained yourself, the more certain you became of who you were. This certainty was not loud or boastful. It was steady. It did not demand recognition. It did not seek applause. It simply existed. And because it existed quietly, it was difficult for others to interpret. They mistook your stillness for uncertainty, unaware that stillness was the very environment where your conviction solidified. Your silence was not avoidance. It was alignment. It was the conscious decision to prioritize growth over gratification, depth over drama, peace over performance. And alignment changes a person in ways that are not immediately visible, but profoundly undeniable. Eventually, the weight of your absence settled in. Conversations shifted. Curiosity grew. Assumptions evolved. They began to sense that something fundamental had changed. The version of you that once reacted predictably was gone. In its place stood someone composed, deliberate, and emotionally disciplined. What unsettled them was not hostility. It was composure. They could not provoke what was no longer reactive. They could not manipulate what was no longer seeking validation. They could not control what had surrendered control to God. Your silence became a structure they could not enter. It was built from reflection, strengthened by discipline, and anchored in alignment. It did not need explanation because its presence was self-evident. In choosing not to respond impulsively, you demonstrated a level of mastery they had not anticipated. You showed that maturity does not always manifest in speeches or confrontations. Sometimes it manifests in restraint, and restraint, when guided by divine awareness, becomes authority. This is where the shift truly began, not in their perception of you, but in your perception of yourself. Silence revealed your capacity for self-control. It exposed the depth of your growth. It confirmed that you were no longer operating from wounded reaction, but from intentional alignment. This is only the beginning of the unfolding story, because silence does not end narratives. It redirects them. In the next part, we will step further into what happened after your disappearance became undeniable, how their internal narratives began to unravel, and how God positioned you beyond the reach of the very egos that once sought to control your response. After your absence became consistent, something subtle but undeniable began happening behind the scenes. The same people who once spoke about you with certainty began speaking about you with uncertainty. The tone shifted. The confidence in their assumptions weakened. Conversations that once revolved around predicting your next move were replaced with quiet speculation about whether you would ever return at all. At first, pride protected them from admitting anything had changed. They acted unaffected. They carried on as if your disappearance was insignificant. But human nature cannot ignore patterns for long, and your silence had become a pattern. The absence of your reactions created a void that their egos could not easily explain away. In private spaces, questions began to surface. Why had you not responded? Why had you not defended yourself? Why had you not corrected the narrative? Why had you not tried to restore what was lost? These questions did not come from love. They came from discomfort. Because when someone no longer reacts, it removes the illusion of influence. Influence depends on response. Control depends on predictability. And you had quietly removed both. They were accustomed to your emotional transparency. They were familiar with your expressive honesty. They understood how to navigate your reactions because you had once allowed them access to your immediate thoughts. But now, that access was gone. They were no longer inside your emotional process. They were no longer witnesses to your internal world. And what people cannot see, they struggle to understand. Behind closed doors, your silence became a topic of discussion. Not because you were loud, but because you were no longer available. There is something profoundly unsettling about realizing that someone you once affected deeply is no longer moved by your presence. That realization does not wound the heart first. It unsettles the ego. God had positioned you in stillness, and that stillness began revealing the true motives around you. There was a moment, perhaps subtle and unspoken, when they tested the waters. A small comment, a subtle reference, an indirect attempt to provoke engagement. They expected curiosity. They expected correction. They expected that familiar spark of reaction that once confirmed they still had influence over you. But nothing came. No confrontation. No clarification. No emotional shift. You did not rise to defend. You did not rush to explain. You did not chase the opportunity to be heard. And in that lack of response, something within them faltered. Because provocation only works when the other person participates. Ego only thrives when it can measure its impact. When they realized they could no longer extract reaction from you, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their access had expired. This expiration was not announced. It was not dramatic. It was not accompanied by declarations. It was simply evident in your consistency. Your silence was not sporadic. It was steady. It was not passive aggression. It was disciplined restraint. It was not confusion. It was clarity. And clarity, when embodied quietly, feels like distance to those who once felt close. They began to sense that you were no longer operating from the same emotional frequency. The arguments that once mattered to you no longer seemed relevant. The narratives that once demanded correction no longer required your energy. Your internal priorities had shifted, and they were not informed of the change. That is what unsettled them most. God had moved you forward without consulting their expectations. When you were expressive, they understood you. Even in disagreement, they could predict your emotional language. But silence made you unreadable. And unreadable people feel powerful because they are not easily categorized. Your quietness created mystery where there had once been transparency. They could no longer determine whether you were hurt, angry, indifferent, or simply evolved. And when people cannot define your emotional state, they cannot control the narrative around it. Some tried to assume you were struggling. It comforted them to believe your silence was weakness. Others tried to assume you were plotting, because imagining you unaffected felt threatening. But none of their theories satisfied the unease that lingered, because deep down, they sensed something different. They sensed growth. Growth does not always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks distant. Sometimes it looks detached. Sometimes it looks like someone who has quietly redefined what deserves attention. You were no longer reacting from old wounds. You were no longer defending outdated identities. You were no longer participating in cycles that drained your spirit. And because you did not announce this transformation, it appeared sudden to them. But it was not sudden. It was cultivated. God had been reshaping you long before they noticed your absence. The most uncomfortable stage of your silence was not your withdrawal. It was their reflection. Without your participation to distract them, they were left alone with their own behavior. The jokes that once felt harmless began to sound different in your absence. The criticisms that once seemed justified began to echo louder without your defense softening their impact. When someone no longer fights to stay connected, it forces a different kind of introspection. They began replaying conversations in their minds. They reconsidered their tone. They examined moments they had dismissed as insignificant. This was not necessarily remorse. It was realization. Realization that perhaps they had misjudged your value. Realization that perhaps they had relied too heavily on your patience. Realization that perhaps your presence had been stabilizing in ways they never acknowledged. But ego does not surrender easily. It wrestles with pride before it admits truth. So, instead of openly acknowledging the shift, they oscillated between denial and curiosity. They attempted to maintain their composure publicly while privately feeling the weight of your absence. Your silence did not accuse them. It did not attack them. It simply exposed the imbalance that once existed. And exposure makes ego uncomfortable. While they were analyzing your quietness, you were not focused on them. Your energy had redirected inward. You were investing in peace. You were cultivating discipline. You were strengthening boundaries that once felt unnatural. You were no longer available for emotional chaos, not because you lacked compassion, but because you had discovered the cost of constant accessibility. There is a difference between being loving and being endlessly available to dynamics that diminish you. God was teaching you that difference. As you grew more comfortable in your silence, something unexpected happened. You felt lighter. The urge to defend yourself lost its intensity. The need to clarify every misunderstanding lost its urgency. You were no longer fighting to control perception. You were allowing perception to exist without your interference. And that surrender created freedom. Freedom from the exhausting need to be understood by everyone. Freedom from the pressure to respond immediately. Freedom from the cycle of proving and reproving your worth. This freedom did not make you distant from truth. It brought you closer to it. Because truth does not require constant defense. It remains steady, regardless of commentary. God had positioned you in a place where your silence became testimony, not a loud declaration, not a public statement, but a lived demonstration of transformation. As time continued to pass and your silence remained consistent rather than impulsive, something far more significant began to unfold beyond the surface of visible interactions. What once seemed like a simple withdrawal from unnecessary conflict gradually revealed itself as a complete shift in atmosphere around your life. The same environments that once felt heavy with expectation, tension, and unspoken competition began to feel distant from you, as though you were no longer operating within the same emotional climate. Your absence did not merely remove your voice from certain spaces, it altered the energy of those spaces altogether. People who once thrived on provoking your reaction found themselves without direction, as if a dynamic they unconsciously relied on had been quietly dismantled. Conversations that once revolved around your responses began to dissolve into irrelevance because there was nothing new to analyze. The silence created a vacuum, and that vacuum slowly exposed how much of the previous atmosphere had depended on your participation. At the same time, within you, something far more profound was taking shape. What others perceived as disappearance was in truth repositioning. God was not removing you from the narrative. He was elevating you beyond the need to constantly defend your place within it. You were no longer competing for space in rooms that misunderstood you. You were no longer striving to be heard by those who only listened selectively. Instead, you were being prepared for environments where your presence would not need to be justified. This shift did not arrive with dramatic announcements or visible milestones. It unfolded quietly, in your thoughts, in your boundaries, in the way you began to value your peace over performance. The atmosphere around you changed because your internal atmosphere had changed first. And when internal alignment deepens, external reality gradually follows. Those who once believed they understood you began to sense that something about you felt different, even if they could not articulate what had changed. When they occasionally observed you from a distance, whether through indirect updates or shared circles, they noticed a composure that had not been present before. It was not arrogance, nor was it indifference. It was a steadiness that suggested you were no longer seeking confirmation of your worth. What unsettled them most was not your silence itself, but the transformation that accompanied it. You were no longer reacting to subtle provocations. You were no longer adjusting your tone to accommodate fragile egos. You were no longer shrinking to preserve comfort in spaces that had grown too small for your evolution. The version of you they remembered was expressive and immediate. The version of you they now sensed was deliberate and grounded. This growth had not occurred overnight. It had been cultivated in solitude, strengthened in reflection, and anchored through alignment with God. In the quiet spaces where you once would have rehearsed arguments, you instead examined your own patterns. In moments where you once would have prepared defenses, you instead deepened your understanding of yourself. You allowed silence to become a teacher rather than a punishment. Because this growth was internal and unannounced, it appeared sudden to outsiders. They could not trace the gradual transformation, because they had not been present for the private work. To them, it seemed as though you had changed abruptly. In truth, you had simply stopped performing your growth publicly. God had been refining you in places no one else could see, shaping your character in moments that did not require validation. And refinement often creates a version of you that feels unfamiliar to those who benefited from your former accessibility. As your focus shifted away from defending yourself and towards strengthening yourself, opportunities began to align in ways that felt subtle yet undeniable. These opportunities did not necessarily arrive as dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, they manifested as clarity, as new connections, as environments that resonated differently with your energy. It was as though once you withdrew from dynamics that drained you, space was created for dynamics that supported you. The absence of constant emotional turbulence allowed you to recognize possibilities that had previously been overshadowed by distraction. Conversations became more intentional. Interactions felt less performative. You began encountering individuals who did not require your constant explanation, who did not interpret your silence as weakness, but as composure. This was not coincidence. When you stop engaging in cycles that limit you, you become available for cycles that expand you. God was not simply teaching you discipline. He was redirecting your trajectory. The silence that once felt like isolation gradually revealed itself as preparation. While others were still analyzing your disappearance, you were stepping into spaces they never anticipated you would occupy. The advancement was not loud. It did not seek acknowledgement from those you had left behind. It unfolded naturally, as a consequence of alignment rather than ambition. Your growth began to speak in ways words never could. The steadiness in your presence became evident. The confidence in your decisions became visible, and the absence of desperation in your energy became unmistakable. One of the most profound transformations that occurred during your silence was the development of internal authority. Previously, you may have measured your impact through response, gauging your influence by how quickly others reacted to you. But as you stepped back, you realized that true authority does not require constant confirmation. Internal authority is the quiet assurance that you are aligned, even when misunderstood. It is the confidence that your value remains intact, even when unrecognized. It is the discipline to maintain composure when provoked, not because you lack emotion, but because you have mastered it. God was strengthening this authority within you. He was teaching you that leadership in your own life begins with self-control. He was revealing that the loudest voices are not always the strongest, and that sometimes the most powerful position is the one that refuses unnecessary engagement. As this authority solidified, you felt less compelled to revisit old dynamics. The need to explain yourself diminished naturally. You were no longer searching for closure in places that could not offer it. Instead, you carried closure within yourself. This internal shift did not isolate you. It liberated you. It freed you from the invisible chains of expectation. It removed the burden of constantly proving your worth. It allowed you to exist without performing for approval. And that liberation radiated outward. Eventually, your silence ceased to be perceived as temporary. It became understood as a standard. The people who once anticipated your immediate reaction began to accept that your boundaries were not situational, they were structural. You were no longer available for dynamics that thrived on emotional volatility. This realization altered how others approached you. Some withdrew entirely, unable to navigate your new steadiness. Others observed cautiously, unsure how to interpret the composure that replaced former accessibility. A few recognized the growth and respected it, understanding that what looked like distance was actually maturity. Your silence had evolved from a response into an identity marker. It represented your commitment to alignment over impulse. It demonstrated your willingness to prioritize peace over pride. It revealed that you trusted God's process more than you trusted your urge to react. And in that trust, something extraordinary occurred. Your disappearance no longer felt like loss. It felt like transition. What began as withdrawal had become advancement. What once looked like retreat had become repositioning. As your silence settled into permanence rather than pause, the distance between you and certain individuals began to expose truths that had previously been hidden beneath constant interaction. When you were always present, always responding, always explaining, there was little room to observe motives clearly. Engagement often masks intention. Noise can disguise insecurity. But distance has a way of clarifying everything. Without your immediate availability, the dynamics around you were forced to stand on their own. Relationships that depended entirely on your emotional labor began to weaken because there was no longer a steady supply of your attention to sustain them. Conversations that once felt urgent were revealed as unnecessary. Conflicts that once seemed significant were exposed as repetitive cycles that thrived only because you participated in them. God allowed this distance, not as punishment for anyone, but as revelation for you. Through silence, you began to see which connections were rooted in mutual respect and which were anchored in convenience. You recognized who valued your presence beyond your reactions, and who valued your reactions more than your presence. That distinction became impossible to ignore. This clarity did not make you bitter. It made you aware. Awareness does not always feel comfortable, but it is liberating. You no longer romanticized dynamics that drained you. You no longer justified patterns that diminished you. The emotional fog lifted, and in its place stood discernment. And discernment changes everything. There was a time when access to you felt ordinary to them. They assumed your attention was guaranteed. They believed your availability was a constant. Because you had always responded, always engaged, always shown up emotionally, they grew accustomed to that accessibility as though it were an entitlement rather than a privilege. But silence recalibrated that perception. As weeks and months passed without the familiar exchange, they began to understand something they had overlooked. Access to you had never been automatic. It had been a gift, and gifts are often taken for granted until they are withdrawn. When you stopped offering immediate responses, when you stopped explaining yourself repeatedly, when you stopped revisiting the same conversations in different forms, they felt the shift. Not because you announced boundaries with hostility, but because your consistency quietly enforced them. The realization did not arrive with applause or confession. It surfaced slowly, in moments of reflection, in subtle acknowledgments that the dynamic had changed. They could no longer rely on you to validate their perspective through reaction. They could no longer provoke reassurance of their influence over you. The emotional doorway that once stood open had been gently but firmly closed. This closure was not revenge, it was maturity. God was teaching you that peace requires structure, and structure requires limits. You did not become unreachable, you became intentional.